Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are discussing an important new UHERO report, the downmarket impact of new multifamily housing, evidence from a Honolulu condo tower. The report looks at the new residents of the Central, a newly built condo tower near Ala Moana Center here in Honolulu, and what housing they moved out of, including the price, size, and location. It examines filtering, the claim that even expensive luxury condos will filter down to the middle and working classes by causing a chain of moves that will open up inexpensive housing downstream. We're pleased to welcome two of the report's co-authors today, Professors Justin Tyndall and Limin Fang, to share their findings and discuss what they could mean for housing policy in Hawaii. Dr. Justin Tyndall is a UHERO researcher and University of Hawaii economist whose research focuses on housing affordability and urban policy. Dr. Limin Fang is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia's Sauder School of Business, whose research examines housing economics, market competition, and the role of public policy in shaping housing outcomes. Among other degrees, she has a Bachelor of Science from the Peking University in China. Before they begin the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom throughout the presentation. And after the presentation, we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Professors Tyndall and Fang.
Fantastic. Okay, so thanks a lot for inviting us and for holding this webinar. I'm going to present the paper, and then I'll try to be as brief as I can, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So this is a paper we've worked on the last couple of years, so you might have seen it pop up in the media last year as a working paper through UHERO, and now we have it published version available. So to start off, I like to start presentations with this slide pretty often. So this is just looking at the distribution of construction date for all of the homes currently in Honolulu, okay, by decade. So this is sort of, I think if there was one slide that would explain sort of why we're in a housing crisis, why housing is so expensive in Honolulu, this is my go-to. So as you can see, we had this big housing boom in the 1970s, right? So we built an incredible amount of housing in that decade. 1980s, we built about half as much as we did in the 1970s. 1990s, we built a little bit less. Then the 1980s, 2000s, we built less than the 1990s, and 2010s, we built less than the 2000s. And 2020s aren't finished yet, but when they are, I can pretty much guarantee you that the bar will be even lower than the 2010s, right? So we built less and less housing every decade. The majority of housing in the state and in city and county of Honolulu was built before the 1980s, right? 1970s or earlier. I'm sitting in a 1972 apartment right now. Like the typical, person in the state is living in housing that's, about 50 years old. So I think this is an important piece of background information when we're thinking about, how we solve housing affordability and what we can do to make housing more affordable for people. So this graph on the right here is sort of similar story, right? So this is across the state, but the sort of full set of our housing stock, what portion of it would we consider, to be new housing, let's say built after 2020, about 3%. So like 97% of homes were built before 2020. And one, important fact is that new housing tends to be more expensive than old housing, right? So just by virtue of being new, when we have brand new housing, it tends to command a premium in the market, be a little bit more expensive. So if we, try to think about policy conversations around housing, almost exclusively we have conversations around what we can do to make brand new housing as affordable as possible, right? So inclusionary zoning rules on new construction, endless debates on, individual projects. If we think of sort of every instance of public meetings and policy debates on new construction of housing, it's often based around, should we or shouldn't we build this housing, and what percentage of it will be affordable to, people earning what portion of local income. So, all of those conversations are important, but really they're important to maybe like 3% of housing, right? So all of those conversations, don't amount to much in terms of the overall housing market. The fact is that most of us just circulate in the older housing market, right? So, whether you are buying or renting, you go between a few housing units in your lifetime or maybe more, but you're circulating in the sort of quote unquote used housing market, right? The reality is, most of us will never live in a brand new housing unit, just because they're a very small share of the market. So, why do we spend so much time worrying about the price of brand new housing uh, uh, if most people will never even live in them? And they're expensive, so most lower income people will never live in brand new housing. So, why do we talk about it so much? And, why do we even build it, right? If it's not going to be accessible to people, why do we build new, particularly market rate housing? And one argument the economists make is, we still need to build this housing because it generally pushes down the price of housing across the market by pushing up the supply, right? So if we generally increase the supply of a good, we should see the price come down. This is true for apples. This should probably also be true for housing, but it's an open question. So how would building new market rate housing affect prices in the lower end of the market? The process proposed is this housing filtering. So someone moves into a brand new expensive unit, vacating a different unit. Maybe that unit is more affordable. So the idea of this paper is to sort of try to explore that as explicitly as we can with some interesting data we have. So yeah, this is the paper. It's available. So the case study we're using, we're going to do a deep dive into one specific building. This is the Central, right? It's right by Ala Moana Mall, finished in 2021, built through the state 201H program. So, this allows the developer to get around some county zoning rules, fees, and regulations. Sort of in exchange, they have to provide the majority of the units at only accessible to people earning lower income. So for this project, 60% of the units are only available to people earning below 120% of area median income, and there's different tranches for different income cutoffs. So, the main research question here is, who moved into this building? Where did they come from? And what was the effect on sort of broader market vacancies, across Honolulu and the state? So the way we're able to do this is we purchased this data set called consumer reference data. So this is a company, their main client is people who want to send you junk mail. So they have these like very incredible databases on where everyone lives, right? Where consumers live. They claim they have sort of eyes on like close to 100% of the American population. In our experience with the data, it's more like 50%, right? So we have a sample, but a very large sample covering, about half of the population. So, in order to give you your junk mail, they have your address. But importantly for us, they also have sort of past years of the data. So we can look at the current roster of who's living in the Central, but then we can also look them up in previous years. So we can tell you, where did they move from? And what happened to the household they left behind? Did it become vacant? Did it contribute to housing affordability by becoming available for another local resident? So, we combine this with some other data resources we have. So this is sort of a schematic of the Central, right? The example we're looking at. So the each box is a condo unit here. The ones with the heavier outline are the income restricted ones, only available to people earning below certain income thresholds. The developer was able to pack these mostly on the bottom floors and, sell the market rate ones for what they wanted to on the higher floors. These are assessed values. So, the typical unit in this building is currently assessed about $1 million. We have some quite a bit lower, smaller studios for the income restricted units that go down to 400,000. The nice 3-bedroom penthouse at the top is like 2.5 million or something like this. So the C's here are also just sort of some more context to get an idea of sort of who's buying these units. So the boxes with a C, if you can see that, indicate that the person did not get a mortgage. They just plopped down cash for their unit. So basically all of the income restricted units came with a mortgage. So people, in order to be eligible, they couldn't have above a certain amount of wealth or income, so they needed a mortgage. So, I'm not sure exactly what happened with this person, but virtually 100% of the units, it was a mortgage. But, about 40% of the market rate units, the person didn't get a mortgage. They just, had $1 million lying around to purchase the unit, right? So they just paid cash. So this is the other information we have. So, the tiny numbers in here are the number of people we identify in the unit through this consumer reference data, right? So this is a significant undercount, right? So some of these units that are empty could be two things, right? The unit's literally empty, nobody's living there, or we just don't have data coverage for that particular unit. So the gray units are owner occupied. So the law for the income restricted units is you have to be an owner occupant. So we see a few instances of non-owner occupants. Someone might have died. There's other sort of extenuating circumstances that maybe the person isn't able to live there, but almost all of the income restricted units are owner occupied. About 40% of the market rate units are not owner occupied, right? So they're again, we don't know the exact case for each of them, right? Some of them have people living in them though, right? So for probably the majority of these, they're being rented out, right? An investor bought it and then rented it out to a local family. But some of them might just be sitting empty as, investment vehicles. We unfortunately don't have perfect answers to, what percentage of these units are sitting empty. That will be a future research. Our best guess is about 10% of the market rate units were sitting empty. So given our data coverage rates, we find someone living in about half of the income restricted units and about 45% of the market rate units. So sort of scaling up for missing data, our best guess is about 10% of the market rate units are actually sitting empty, but we don't have perfect data on that. Okay, so the basic idea of housing filtering and what we do in this paper is, so the method we used was to just manually look up past addresses of everyone in this building, right? So it's kind of how I spent my summer last year. Was I would go to, the first unit in the building, look up the person who lived there or the family who lived there, and then try to look them up again in previous years of the data. So this is just one example, but we did this for every unit, right? So in this case, we find someone moving into a unit, and we find their previous address was a single family home in Kulioo. Okay, so they moved out of the single family home into their new condominium. But then what happened to their single family home, right? So in this case, they vacated it and someone else was able to move into it. So we find the family that moved into that single family home. We find their previous address. So in this case, they moved from a single family home in Hawaiʻi into this newly vacated single family home. Someone then moved into their vacated home, right? They've also vacated a home, in this case, in Mililani. Someone moved from Kalihi to Mililani into that vacated home. Someone moved from Makiki to Kalihi to that vacated home. And someone moved into that vacant home in Makiki, right? So we built, in this chain, one condo unit, and all of these households benefited to some extent because they were able to find housing that probably would not have been available otherwise. So this is general idea that we're trying to test and investigate, right? If we build, in this case, a market rate condominium unit, it does have this sort of ripple effect through the vacancy market, right? All of these units become available because people are able to, upgrade to find a unit that better suited their needs, right? They're all moving voluntarily, right? They're now in a home that they presumably like better because they chose to make that move. And importantly, freeing up another housing unit for someone else in the market. So, I won't go through the 512 examples, right? But I'll do one more example. So this is another instance. So we have a unit in the central. In this case, we find two people moving in together from different prior addresses. So for one person moving into this unit, they were living with mom and dad in Salt Lake. So they move into the new condominium, but they don't create a vacancy because mom and dad stayed behind in the unit, right? So maybe this is nice for mom and dad or for this person, right? That they now get more space or, get a different living situation, but, it doesn't create another vacancy. In this case, we find the person they moved in with moved from, very old, this was low price point rental apartment, built in the 1960s in Makiki. So they moved from this apartment into the condominium. And then we can look at who moved into that unit, and I picked this case because it's, illustrative or interesting. We find someone moving into that newly vacated apartment. They were placed there from previously living in a transitional housing development on Oahu for people who were experiencing homelessness, right? So presumably this, frees up an additional bed in this homeless shelter. So, this is sort of the idea people like, economists are excited about, right? Like, so to what extent do we contribute to housing affordability and availability, even at the very low end of the market by building, condominium projects, in this case, 2 steps away, we go from the brand new, condominium to, freeing up a bed for someone experiencing homelessness. Okay, so we do this for all of the units. We find, 198 examples on Oahu of units that were part of these filtering chains, right? Spread out, in most sort of populated areas of the county, but definitely concentrated in locally, right? So a lot of people were moving, from a Ala Moana area address to the central, or from other central neighborhoods. So across the whole data set, right, we don't have 100% data coverage, but if we look at the full building, we find 224 addresses that are part of these movement chains, and 180 of them became vacated. Okay, so we have about a little worse than half of data coverage. So, we do some calculations, and our best estimate is if we had perfect data, we would find about 500. So our estimate is, by building the central, we create those units, but we also create about 500 additional induced vacancies. This is in the first 3 years after the building was completed, in other parts of the housing market. Okay, so one question we were very interested in was, what are the characteristics of these units that were vacated? Particularly what are their price points? So this is looking at the assessed value across the units. So the average unit in the central is assessed at about $1 million, right? So these are $1 million condos. What was the price of the typical unit left behind by someone moving into the central? It was about $740,000, right? So significantly cheaper. As we get to higher rounds, our standard errors get quite large because we don't have as many data points, because we sort of lose people tracking through the rounds. But we also find even lower, slightly lower prices in the higher rounds. And this is generally true for both market rate and income restricted units. The market rate units are more expensive, but we find cheaper units that are filtered, and similarly for the income restricted units. It's even clearer if you look at price per square foot. So the market rate units tended to be a bit bigger. This is one reason why they're more expensive. But if we look at price per square foot, so across the whole building, the average price per square foot is about $1,200, which is pretty expensive for housing. But if we look at the price per square foot of the units vacated by people moving into the central, is about $700, right? So we find a 40% price drop going from the assessed value of the central to the units that were left behind by people, and fairly similar drops, but even a larger drop amongst the income restricted units. People tend to move from relatively old housing into the central. So, central was brand new, so built in 2021. So the typical person was leaving behind a unit built in about 1985. Again, somewhat true for both market rate and income restricted units. For just these market rate units, the typical person was leaving behind a unit built in about 1995. For income restricted units, more like 1980, right? So, for these people, big upgrade in terms of like how old their housing stock is, but leaving behind, much older housing, which will tend to be, more affordable, which is what we found. Okay, so this is, sort of, another unique criticism, perhaps, of condo development is, sure, we're building housing, but it's not really like the housing that people want. And, particularly, we're not building enough larger units for people with big families, right? And this is generally true, right? So condominiums tend to skew towards smaller units, right? That's sort of how the incentives are set up for developers, at least historically. So they like to build small units. Tends to be true in the central. So there are a few 3-bedroom units in the central, but not that many, and nothing bigger units. So this graph is looking at, what is the distribution of units by bedroom across these different rounds. So in round one, right, we find a doubling of the number of units that have 3 or more bedrooms. So more, we find single family homes in here in particular, right, and a bigger distribution of unit sizes. And this seems to increase with the rounds, right? We're sort of just heading towards just the general distribution of housing stock in the county. Vacancies that are induced by these chains. Last sort of finding that I'll highlight is, we also look at some indicators of what economists typically call neighborhood quality. In this case, looking at education. So for the Ala Moana census tract, the share of people with a college education, is very high, like 70% of adults have a college education. If we look at the neighborhoods people were leaving behind to move into the central, about 45% college education rate, right? So people are moving from lower education, and we also find lower income neighborhoods into higher education, higher income neighborhoods, and this is true for both the market rate and income restricted units. Okay, so sort of summarize. So new condominium units contribute to local housing supply, not only directly, but also we find through this process of filtering. In the case of the central, we found about 500 local vacancies were induced through filtering in the first 3 years after the central was built. So we also find that they tend to be quite a bit more affordable. So in terms of price per square foot, these vacated units through filtering were about 40% more affordable than those in the central. One thing we're interested in thinking more about is, what does this mean for inclusionary zoning policies? So, in Hawaii and, pretty much everywhere in the US, we have rules that say, developers can only build if they include a certain percentage of units set aside for people with lower income. So sort of this gives us a unique opportunity to sort of contrast, what are the broader market effects of the market rate versus the income restricted units in this case. So we actually find that the market rate units produce more vacancies, per unit built. So why would that be? So in a lot of cases, the income restricted units are going to people who were leaving behind. Mom and dad seems to be very common, or like a roommate situation, right? So if you move out of mom and dad's house, you don't create an additional vacancy, right? Because they're probably staying there. So this is maybe still good. Like another policy goal we might have is to reduce overcrowding. Lots of people live with mom and dad because they love it. Some people do because they can't afford other options, right? So we're creating this new opportunity, but it doesn't necessarily create these chain reactions of vacancies. Whereas the market rate units, in almost all cases, it was the whole family moving together, right? And they did create a vacancy. So we do find the market rate units are sort of more impactful in terms of the overall vacancies created. But the trade-off is for the smaller number of induced vacancies from the income restricted units, they do tend to be cheaper. So if we went back to those graphs, you would notice the price declines in income restricted units are sharper, and they reach down to a lower price point, right? So if we were just interested in sort of creating vacancies in the very low end market, then there's an argument for having income restricted units. But if we were interested in generally increasing vacancies, pushing down prices more generally, then there's stronger argument for just doing more market rate units. Because sort of the trade-off on top of that is, developers won't build anything if the income restrictions, the inclusionary zoning rules are too onerous, right? So, 60% of this building was income restricted, which is, a pretty high portion by sort of national standards of what's usually required. But, without that 40% market rate, this project would have certainly fallen apart, right, from the financing perspective, right? You needed that 40% market rate in order to get the whole thing to go forward. So, some things me and Limin had, battered around was, what's the optimal amount of inclusionary zoning? But, we didn't quite get an answer for you on that. But, these are sort of the trade-offs that would inform that discussion, I think, right? And, I think one point is that these market rate units, they're, not only directly adding housing stock in that segment of the market, but they are having, larger market effects by generally pushing up the supply of housing. So, I think even more generally, when we have conversations around sort of restoring housing affordability in Hawaii, I think that sort of first couple graphs, trying to pay some attention to the effect of policy on existing housing stock and existing price points, right? Most of us will never live in one of these new condominiums, unfortunately, but most of us will be affected by the market price in the used housing market or across the broader market. And I think there's a lot of evidence in this study and studies we cite that generally pushing up housing supply has broad benefits for affordability because it pushes down prices across the whole market. Okay. I hope I didn't talk too fast, but that's all we have. But I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Tyndall. And as a reminder to our guests, you can type in any questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as possible before the end of the hour today. So a first question, just to kick things off, why did you select the Central as the condo tower that you were going to focus on? And is it representative of new condo construction here in Honolulu?
So I think, the honest answer is we first were looking sort of better data coverage, which the Central had. So in that sense, it was a little bit a random selection because it happened to have a pretty good coverage. But I think, we were looking for as large a project as possible to give us a bigger sample size and as recent a project as possible to be most relevant to sort of current discussions. So the Central sort of fit that mold. I think I've gotten a lot of questions, does this apply to this or that type of housing? I think like the short answer is, we only looked at one building. So we have to speculate a bit as to how this filtering process translates into other types of housing. I think people, in Honolulu, if you look at like super high-end luxury towers, maybe there's an argument that these are more likely to end up as second homes and the filtering process is less active. I think we don't really know, but I think I'm open to that type of argument. I think it is nice in this project, we're able to look at market rate and income restricted separately and find that they both have very similar properties in terms of filtering. So my hypothesis is this would, apply to a broad set of buildings, but, a topic for future research is to sort of apply this to other building types and see how it plays out.
So you're very aware of the concerns raised by opponents of new development who say this building is way too expensive. Nobody can afford, no local people can afford to live there. And I guess, this whole filtering process is one answer to that question. Actually, it does create this chain of other, less expensive homes that are going to open up. For a lot of folks who are objecting to a project, they tend to live in the immediate vicinity of a project. And they tend to be concerned that the new development will change the character of their neighborhoods because the new residents will be younger or older or wealthier or poorer or noisier or just somehow otherwise different from the existing pool of residents. What message would you have for those concerned neighbors?
You have thoughts, Limin, or you want me to take it?
Feel free to take it. You go ahead first.
I think that's a separate question. I mean, so me and Limin have a different paper, looking at sort of neighborhood political pressures on blocking new housing. So, I mean, I think this is, one of the biggest barriers to getting housing built, right, is sort of this NIMBYism mechanism that, people don't want to see their own neighborhood change. If you poll people people, nationally or in Honolulu, making housing more affordable is the issue people point to as the most important. And most people think we should build a lot more housing. But people generally don't want it in their own neighborhood. So, I think there's, maybe this is more Stanley's job than my job, but there's a political solution to this that, it is difficult, right? So I think what some states have done that's been effective to some extent is sort of state preemption laws that say, okay, as a state, we want to build more housing. Everyone's going to have to share in the, quote unquote burden of, having more development locally. So we're going to make laws that say, it's more difficult to block housing just because of sort of neighborhood interests. But obviously, this is very politically contentious. But I think that's the trade-off, right? So we can give people more power to block developments in their own neighborhood because maybe that's something they want individually. But the result of that is going to be less housing generally. And as we find, through filtering and general supply effects, when we allow people to do that, then we don't build much housing, and housing becomes really expensive, and we have all of these social problems associated with expensive housing. So, but I don't have a huge barrier to getting these projects built.
Yeah, and just to add on that point, I think Stanley, your point probably also kind of addressing some concerns about the amenities in the neighborhood of new expensive homes may change. For example, I think the classic theory of gentrification and displacement, right, has this worry that once you have luxury homes, then you're inviting basically wealthier people coming into the neighborhood, and all of these amenities will change, and that eventually will start serving kind of wealthier people, and the existing residents may feel the pressure that everything is becoming more expensive in the neighborhood, and therefore eventually decide to sell, and so they're being displaced. So that's kind of at least one of the major issues being raised by like residents in neighborhoods. So for that, I think we're kind of Justin and I are actually trying to think of another project. We're trying to do another project just to look into this exactly, and also trying to track the neighborhood change. Not only how people move in certain neighborhoods, so not only in the building, but also in the existing neighborhood, in the neighborhoods. So see how people are moving in and out, and also how the amenities, so different, for example, grocery stores, gyms, all those smaller businesses, how they're changing as the result of these luxurious towers or luxurious homes. But one major challenge for that one is, in fact, the causality. So it's more difficult to establish causality. So what is the impact? Will there be an impact of the luxury homes on the displacement of existing residents? But so it's kind of hard to find a counterfactual where if this tower hasn't been built, what would it be like? So the challenge we're facing is causality, establishing causality right now. But that's basically the where we are at. So we're thinking about this problem as well.
Okay, great. We have a couple of questions regarding the duration of the affordability restriction, the income restriction on the units in the central. Was it perpetual? Was it temporary? And how important is the duration or the potential, infinite duration of those restrictions on ensuring a large supply of housing that local people can afford?
Yeah, so I sort of glossed over the details of the income restrictions, but so these are 10-year deed restrictions. So after 10 years, the units revert to market rate. So there's three tranches of them. So one is your income has to be below 100% AMI, so average local income. Another is up to 120, another is up to 140%. So we tried to do a little bit with like, could we say something interesting about how the level of income restrictions, this 100, 120, 140, create different filtering chains or attract different buyers. But the data set was just kind of too small to do anything meaningful. So we don't do too much in that sort of contrast. I mean, I think locally, the thing that developers say is that, when we have experimented with 30-year deed restrictions, this makes it much, much harder to sell these units and find a market. So, 10 years is less burdensome than 30 years, but I think, it still limits the market that these units can be sold into. So yeah, so there's a big trade-off there between, making these projects less profitable, which means we'll make fewer condominium developments generally, right? There'll be fewer opportunities for projects to pencil, the more stringent we have, the lower the income limits, and the more units have to be dedicated to these programs. And yeah, I think the contribution in this paper is we try to sort of, what's the upside of having these income restricted units? And I guess we find in terms of the broader market, not much in terms of like creating broader market affordability, because we find these more robust filtering chains are happening actually in the market rate units. But again, the trade-off is we do find some evidence that the income restricted units are freeing up more, deeply affordable units. But yeah, I think where we're don't get the final answer right is like to what's the optimal level, or what's the how do we compute these trade-offs to answer what should be our income thresholds or percentage set asides for income restricted units. But the bigger question is to what extent do these discourage development in general, which I don't think we have a complete answer on, but I think the answer is to some extent, or to a large extent, developers think a lot about, can this project pencil because of fulfilling these income restriction requirements. But yeah, compared to sort of other programs in the state, 10 years is not too long. So, if people are willing to, live in these units for up to 10 years, then they get the benefit of then being able to sell it back into the market, or benefiting from that increase in equity. I think a lot of these are studios and one bedrooms that are income restricted, right? So, I think even at 10 years, you're hard pressed to find someone who knows they want to live in a studio apartment for 10 years, right? Like there's some people, but for a lot of people, you don't know what your life's going to be like in 10 years. You might meet a partner or want to have kids, or, whatever other situation arises. Or you might get a job offer somewhere else, it's a different neighborhood. You don't want to be in that neighborhood. Any number of things can happen. So, even, if I was assessing this personally, right, considering it, I don't know if I'd want to be locked into a small apartment for 10 years. What if my life changes, right? So I think this is one reason why it makes it difficult to find buyers for these units, because you have to be willing to be locked in for a period of time. I mean, you can sell, but there's limits on appreciation you can claim, and you have to sell it to someone else who fulfills these qualifications. So it's difficult to do that. But I think broader conversations too, the benefit of these is that we're ensuring these units aren't going to sit empty. They're going to go to a local family, right? That's going to be an owner occupant. So, I think, we can think about policy that sort of preserves that element, right? Conversations around like a vacancy tax, like maybe we can more directly target discouraging units sitting empty, or, thinking about whether these income thresholds are optimal or necessary in all cases, right? Maybe an owner-occupant restriction, fulfills this, solves this policy by not allowing units to sit empty, but doesn't create the same burden as having stringent deed restrictions on income and wealth. But again, we don't have the complete answer for what the optimal is, but I think those are important, the framework we should be thinking about when we think about these policies.
We have a question. Does your report consider how many people are looking at a single family home or for a single family home, but purchase a condo because it is the only thing available? So part of what you were talking about is matching supply to demand, and whether there's more demand for studios, condos. One of the interesting findings that you had was that a lot of the folks were actually vacating larger units to move into these smaller condos. Is it because it's the only thing in town, or maybe is it because they're empty nesters who want to downsize into something smaller, or is it younger people who are working in town who would rather prefer a shorter commute? Did you folks have findings on those?
So I think we have quite a few anecdotes of empty nesters. So there seems to be quite a few instances of people like leaving a single family home in Manoa or another single family home neighborhood and moving into these units. There's sort of imperfect data on age in the data set. So, we weren't able to do like a very complete analysis, but that's certainly something that happens. I think the sort of revealed preference, economists would say, right, is all of these people chose to move out of their prior address and into a condominium. So in some extent, they were, willing to do that. I think, though it's true, for most people, I think if you surveyed, they would prefer to live in a single family home than a condominium. But the reality is that the condominium that they did move into was the best option available, right? Because that's, the one they chose. So, providing people more opportunities, is welfare enhancing. People are better off because they had that opportunity. If we didn't provide that condo, they would have ended up somewhere else, or they, might have moved out of state or something more drastic, but, they would have ended up at a housing unit that they preferred less than than when we did build the condominium. So yeah, I mean, another short answer is I don't think we have a good answer. It would be very interesting to survey these people and see, if this was their preference or they would have preferred a single family home. I'm sure that's the case for quite a few people, but I think on the other hand, developers have pretty strong incentives to do market research and try to determine whether there's adequate demand for these units, and typically determine there is, and they find people willing to move into a small condominium. But I think the one upshot of filtering is, let's say you're a person who is like terrified, you would never even dream of living in a small condominium. You need a backyard, you need what other amenities of a single family home. But this is still potentially a benefit to you, because that person who was willing to move into the condominium is now no longer competing in the single family home market with you, right? So it pushes down prices in the single family home market. When you end up in that bidding war over the single family home, there's one person who's not there because they ended up in a condominium, right? So this is sort of the general idea of, building supply has these larger ripple effects across the market. As we find a home for one person, that takes them out of the bidding for the remainder of the housing stock. I mean, I think if we think about like high income people in particular, right? If you, had a very high income, maybe you're looking at the penthouse apartment in the central, but if it didn't exist, what are your other options? Like maybe you would buy an old house and knock it down and build yourself a mansion. What else would you do, right? And if we think about like issues with gentrification, a lot of times gentrification is exactly that, right? A rich person can't find the rich person apartment, so they buy a lower price point unit and renovate it, right? So that's sort of what gentrification is, right? We displace lower price point units with higher price point units because rich people are moving into lower price neighborhoods because that's the best option they have. So yeah, I think these higher order ripple effects I think are very interesting, but I think there's still more to research and understand about how exactly they work. When they work best to improve housing affordability across the market, and when they work less well.
Yeah, so just to add onto that, so the one thing we did discover in our research is that in the central for 3-bedroom units, the downsizing is not clear. So there's this kind of I think the second round is even slightly lower than the first round, which means there may be a slight upsizing. So from there we feel that this is either like more of a lateral move, or it could be even upsizing, which means these units, right? If it were in fact upsizing, that means these condo units, large, like the basically 3-bedroom condo units, they can actually house families. So it's not just for single or or kind of couples or empty nesters, but it could also be for families as well. But this, requires a further investigation, right? There's also still the preference in the market for a single family home, like or ground related. So either row houses or townhouses or like a semis or single family homes versus apartments, right? But I think people's preferences are also changing. It would be nice if there could be more policy experiments where we do build apartment buildings with larger units, and we see, where people move to. So that's but that definitely requires further investigation.
Okay, so we have another question. What is the impact of having market rate units sit vacant or used as second homes? How would disallowing second homes or making the price unattractive via property taxes affect the desirability of those units? I know that you folks already mentioned that the 40% of the market rate units was critical to financing the entire building and making available the 60% of the units that were income restricted. And we've seen in recent years here in Honolulu very active attempts to promote second home taxes, empty home taxes, to try to restrict that number to as few units as possible. You said that, I think, if I remember right, only 10% of the market rate units in this building you estimated to be vacant. So do you think that's too small to make a meaningful difference and might throttle future housing construction, or do you think that's an important step that we should consider?
So, I mean, I think if we think of it in terms of a vacancy tax, right? So taxing units that are left vacant, people who own them have a couple of options. They could sell them back into the market or rent them into the market, and that provides housing for people, or they could pay the tax. I think it is an open question to what extent the financing of these buildings depends on second homeowners. Again, we have imperfect data on how many of these units are second homes, but yeah, our best guess is like 10% of the market rate units. So, only like 4% of the building seems to be vacant. So, this suggests it's not that important. You would still be able to sell that 4%, just maybe at a slightly lower price point, because you're not able to market it to second homeowners. So I guess that has two upshots. It wouldn't make a huge difference maybe because this isn't a huge portion of the market for these towers. But also, there's not too much of a downside, right? Because you wouldn't expect it to totally crater the ability to finance these units. Again, it might vary a bit across buildings. So, yeah, I'm open to the idea that super high-end units, in Ward, some of these buildings, are more dependent on second homeowners. But for the majority of buildings we do, they're a lot like the Central, it seems to be not the most important aspect. So yeah, I think, implementing an empty homes tax, for example, we would expect it to help affordability somewhat, but I don't think it would be a complete solution. When we look at track back these vacancy chains manually, that's one way in which these chains break. So not only is there the effect on the Central, but also sometimes, we find someone moved into the Central and the house they left behind seems to be sitting empty, right? So maybe they're waiting for better market conditions to sell it, or maybe they're just holding on to a second home for whatever reason. This sort of kills the vacancy chain, preventing these additional broader market effects. So, that's also potentially damaging. So, a policy that prevented someone from doing that would create more vacancy chains, which should create, downward pressure on prices. But again, I think we have not quite enough data to give you a number on what percentage it would change the home prices. But I think it's an important issue, and it would have a meaningful impact on prices. But it's probably not going to solve our affordability problems on its own.
One of our participants is asking what you think about income blind housing. As you saw in this project, the city council had had specified some very specific tiers at 100, 120, and 140% of AMI in addition to the market rate housing. The state 201H-38 program doesn't actually get that specific. It simply requires a majority of the units to be under 140% AMI. Do you think that those tiers are important? Would it be better if we just let the market decide the prices of all the condos and let filtering take care of the rest?
So I think that's the question that I think we can provide some information that informs that, but I don't have a policy stance personally. I think that's the argument of filtering though, right? So the alternative would be maybe we want to ensure that these are owner occupants or local residents. So we could have policies, we've talked about other policies in Honolulu about, the county buying deed restrictions on units or something like this. So you might require it to not be vacant, but then, yeah, be income blind, removing these, income thresholds, right? So this ends up being pretty burdensome to administer, and this is, also topics for a future paper potentially, but, a lot of the cases we find for the income restricted units, we see a lot of instances of people moving out of mom and dad's house, for example. So, the populations that are benefiting from these programs are, people very good at filling out paperwork and, getting ahead of the game in terms of, scoping out these opportunities for getting in on these income restricted units, right? So whether it's done through lottery or just who's ever most vigilant about applying, right? There's sort of like a windfall profit that goes to who's ever able to secure these units. And, I haven't seen much research on like the distribution of, who is benefiting from these units, right? So we create this huge administrative burden that, I think materially limits the amount of housing we build because it makes it less profitable for developers to build housing in general. And then the upshot is we get to direct some of this housing to a certain population who fulfills these requirements, which are on average lower income than the market rate units. But whether that trade-off is worth it, I'm not sure. And I guess the filtering literature suggests it's probably not. So if we were just interested in having a bigger impact on the 97% of housing that's not new, which maybe is pretty much the whole ball game, then the name of the game is just building more supply to push down prices, in which case we don't care too much about these income restrictions. We just care about how much housing is getting built. So if they are a big barrier to building housing, we're artificially increasing home prices by having these limits.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think there is a social benefit of having these income restricted units. So this building is, in some ways you can see that as a mixed income building, right? So there is always benefit to having a diverse group of people living in the same neighborhood. In economics, there are some inefficiencies, but I think in the kind of urban planning realm, planners or policymakers may want to see more income, like mixed income neighborhoods, right? So basically, the wealthier wealthier residents can in fact bring in higher end amenities, right? And those could be benefited by low income people as well. So I think just if we just let the market drive the filtering process, more likely we're seeing like poorer neighborhoods and high income neighborhoods completely being separated. So I think as a former planner, I guess, former urban planner, I think I would think that it is in fact better to have more mixed income neighborhoods and more mixed income buildings. Because we also don't want to have location-based discrimination, right? Once you tell your friends where you grew up or which neighborhood you grew up, immediately they can tell like what is your income threshold, like what is your background. right? So that sometimes is a neighborhood-based discrimination, and that's not good for anyone.
Okay, well, our time is short today, unfortunately, so maybe we'll just get one more question for the two of you, which is if you had just a top handful or even just one major policy recommendation for policymakers as a result of undertaking this research, what would that be?
So a great question, which I'd like to dodge. So, I think our contribution, right, is to lay out the data and the trade-offs involved and, allow, policymakers to digest that and try to, use this research to inform as good a policy as we can have. I think it gets at, what is the optimal in terms of these income limits, right? So is that useful, right? We have a trade-off here, potentially reducing housing construction on the one hand, and on the other hand, directing units to people with lower income. So the magnitude of those is kind of an open question, but I think, we are discouraging housing production with these rules. So a policy would be to, get rid of these income limits or make them higher. So, in the other UHERO research, right, we track like what amount of money you need to purchase a house, right? So, currently in Honolulu, you need like close to double the median income to carry a mortgage on the median priced home, right? So, you can be earning 180% of AMI and still feel like it's very difficult to afford housing and still might be prone to, leaving the state because you can't afford it. And you also can't qualify for these programs. And the filtering study and, broader literature would say, reducing overall building construction by directing these units, from 170% AMI person to 140% AMI person, might not be worth the trade-off because we're reducing housing construction and the whole population would benefit from having more housing construction. I'll say one other policy is I think so talking about empty homes tax or having deed restrictions that require owner occupancy, I think maybe another consideration is like the politics of giving people peace of mind that these units are occupied, right? So I think it's a common conception, maybe misconception, that a lot of these units are just sitting empty, right? So I think policies like an empty homes tax or some of these restrictions on ensuring owner occupancy, decoupled from these income restrictions, that could build more public support for these types of buildings, right? Because they're sort of dedicated to only house local residents. To try to sort of disentangle that from these more burdensome income restriction rules. But yeah, importantly, we put out the data and it's for others to digest and make policy. But
I agree with everything Justin just said. I don't have anything more to add. It's very comprehensive.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both, Professors Tyndall and Fang, for presenting such interesting research that seeks to track and provide actual statistics, actual real life examples of the filtering process in action. It's often discussed on a theoretical level, but the fact that you were able to demonstrate it happening as a result of an actual building built in Honolulu is quite innovative, and I've seen it cited in the housing debates across the United States as a result. So thank you for your contribution to the literature on housing economics. And thank you everyone else for participating in today's webinar. We have more webinars coming soon, so stay tuned to your email inboxes, sign up for our housing newsletter if you have not already, and keep track of our social media as well. Thank you again, professors, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.